This is a whispered reading of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I've never read this before. I've read a couple other books of his, but never picked this up until today. So since I'm just getting started with it, I thought I'd read the first bit aloud and make an ASMR video of it. So here we go. Chapter 1. At the beginning of July, during a spell of exceptionally hot weather, towards evening, a certain young man came down onto the street from the little room he rented from some tenants in Stilyarny Lane, and slowly, almost hesitantly, off towards Kukushkin Bridge. He had succeeded in avoiding an encounter with his landlady on the stairs. His room was situated right under the roof of a tall 5-story tenement, and sooner resembled a closet than a place of habitation. His landlady, from whom he rented this room with dinner and a maid, lived on the floor below in a separate apartment, and each time he wanted to go down to the street he had to pass his landlady's kitchen, the door of which was nearly always wide open onto the stairs, and each time as he passed it, the young man had a morbid sensation of fear, of which he was ashamed and which caused him to frown. He was heavily in debt to his landlady and afraid of running into her. Not that he was particularly timid or cowed, quite the opposite indeed, but for some time now he had been in an intense, irritable state of mind that verged upon hypochondria. And so absorbed in himself had he grown, so isolated from everyone else, that he was actually afraid of meeting anyone at all, not simply his landlady. He had been crushed by poverty, but even his reduced circumstances had of late ceased to be a burden to him. His vital interests no longer concerned him. He did not even wish to think about them. As a matter of fact, no landlady on earth had the power to make him afraid, whatever she might be plotting against him. But to have to stop on the stairs and listen to all that mediocre rubbish that had nothing whatsoever to do with him, all those pestering demands for payment, those threats and complaints, and be compelled in response to shift his ground, make excuses, tell lies. No, it was better to slink down the stairs like a cat and steal away unseen by anyone. As he emerged onto the street on this occasion, however, the terror of meeting his creditress shocked even him. I plan to attempt a thing like this, yet I allow that kind of rubbish to scare me, he thought with a strange smile. Yes, everything lies in a man's hands, and if he lets it slip past his nose, it's purely out of cowardice. That's an axiom. It's a curious reflection. What are people most afraid of? Of doing something new, saying a new word of their own that hasn't been said before. That's what scares them most. But I'm rambling. That's why I never do anything. Because I ramble on to myself like that. Or perhaps it's the other way around. I ramble because I never do anything. It's during this past month that I picked up this habit of rambling, lying on my back for whole days and nights on end in my room and thinking, what about Cloud Cuckoo Land? Well, why am I on my feet now? Am I really capable of this? Is this a serious matter? Of course it isn't. It's just a fantasy to amuse myself with. It's just pretty pictures. Yes, I do believe that's all it is, pretty pictures. Outside the heat was terrible, with humidity to make it worse, and the crowds of people, the slaked lime everywhere, the scaffolding, the bricks, the dust, and that distinctive summer aroma, so familiar to every inhabitant of St. Petersburg, who has not the means to rent a dacha in the country. All these things had a shattering effect on the young man's already jangled nerves. The unbearable stench from the drinking dens, of which there are in this quarter of the city inordinately many, and the drunks he kept running into every moment or two, even though it was still working hours, completed the sad and loathsome coloring of the scene. An emotion of the most profound repugnance flickered for a moment in the young man's features. It may be worth observing that he was remarkably handsome, with beautiful dark eyes, and dark, chestnut-colored hair. He was taller than average, slim and well-built, but soon he appeared to fall into a deep brooding, which might more correctly have been described as a kind of oblivion. And now, as he walked along, he ceased to be aware of his surroundings, nor had he any desire to be aware of them. Only occasionally did he mutter something to himself, a consequence of that addiction to monologues that he himself had so recently acknowledged. At this moment he himself was conscious that every so often his thoughts grew confused, and that he was very weak. For 2 days now he had had practically nothing at all to eat. So poorly dressed was he that another man, even one inured to such a style of living, would have been ashamed to go out on the street during the daytime in such rags. However, this particular district was of such a kind it would have been difficult to surprise anyone by one's manner of dress. The proximity of the Haymarket, the abundance of brothels and local population, which was, for the most part, made up of tradesmen and craftsmen, streets and lanes of St. Petersburg Center, sometimes enliven the general panorama with such picturesque subjects that it would have been odd for anyone to be surprised at encountering the occasional freak. But by this time so much vicious contempt had built up in the young man's soul that, in spite of his sometimes very youthful finickiness, he was least ashamed of his rags while out on the street. It would have been another matter had he run into people he knew, or any of his erstwhile student colleagues, whom in general he hated meeting at all times. And yet, when a drunken man who at that moment was being hauled off down the street, heaven knows where or by, in an enormous wagon drawn by an equally enormous cart horse, suddenly shouted to him as he rode past, "Hey, you, German hatter!" and began to bellow at him at the top of his voice, pointing at him, the young man suddenly stopped and grabbed convulsively at his hat. The hat had been one of those tall, round affairs from Zimmermann's, but was now completely worn out and faded, covered in holes and stains and missing its brim, so that it cocked over to one side at a most outlandish angle. It was not shame that had assailed him, however, but an emotion of quite a different kind, one more akin to terror. "I might have known it," he muttered in confusion. "I thought as much. This is worse than any of it. It is exactly this sort of nonsense, some vulgar little trivial detail that could ruin the whole plan. Yes, a hat that's too conspicuous. It's absurd, and that's why it's conspicuous. What I need to go with my rags is a peaked cap. Any old flat top will do, but not this museum piece. Nobody wears things like this. It would be spotted a mile off. People would remember it. The main thing is that it would be remembered afterwards, and bang, they'd have their evidence. In this sort of business, you have to be as inconspicuous as possible. The details, it's the details that matter more than anything else. It's that sort of detail that always ruins everything." He did not have far to go. He even knew how many paces he had to take in order to reach the front entrance of his tenement. 730 exactly. He had somehow managed to count them once, which he had been doing rather a lot of dreaming. At the time he had not yet had much faith in these dreams of his, and had merely irritated himself with their outrageous but seductive daring. Now, a month later, he was beginning to see them differently, and, in spite of his teasing monologues about his own impotence and lack of decision, had even come to view his outrageous dream as a practical undertaking, though he still did not really believe he was capable of carrying it through. What he was actually doing now was going to perform a rehearsal of his undertaking, and with every step his excitement mounted higher and higher. His heart standing still, a nervous tremor running through him, he approached an enormous tenement building that overlooked the canal on one side and the street on the other. This building consisted entirely of tiny apartments and was inhabited by all kinds of jobbers and people trying to make a living: tailors, locksmiths, cooks, Germans of various descriptions, prostitutes, petty clerks, and the like. People kept darting in and out of both entrances and through both courtyards. Here 3 or 4 yard keepers were usually on duty. The young man was most relieved not to run into any of them, and he immediately slipped through unnoticed the front entrance and up a staircase to the right. The staircase was dark and narrow, a back stair, but he was already familiar with all this and had studied it, and on the whole the setting appealed to him. In darkness like this, even an inquisitive glance would hold no risk. "If I'm as scared as this now, what would I be like if I were to really go ahead with my plan?" he found himself thinking as he reached the 4th floor. Here this way was barred by some loaders in soldiers' uniforms who were carrying the furniture out of one of the apartments. He knew from earlier observation that a German government clerk and his family were living in this apartment. This means that German's moving out now, and it means that for a while now, on this staircase and this landing, the old woman's apartment is the only one that's going to be occupied. That's just as well, you never know, he thought again, and rang the old woman's doorbell. The bell clanged faintly, as though it were made of tin rather than brass. The doorbells of the small apartments and buildings such as this nearly always made that kind of noise. He had forgotten what it sounded like, and the strange clanking suddenly appeared to remind him of something that came to his mind with great clarity. He gave a terrible shudder, and on this occasion his nerves were simply not up to it. After a while the door opened, the mirror slit. Through it the occupant was scrutinizing the newcomer with evident suspicion, and all that could be seen of her in the darkness was her small, glittering eyes. Observing all the people on the landing, however, she took courage and opened the door the whole way. The young man stepped over a threshold into the dark hallway, divided by a partition, behind which there was a tiny kitchen. The old woman stood in front of him, looking at him questioningly. She was a tiny, dried-up little old woman of about 60, with sharp, hostile eyes, a small, sharp nose, and no head covering. Her white whitish hair, which had not much gray in it, was abundantly smeared with oil. Wound round her long, thin neck, which resembled the leg of a chicken, was an old flannel rag of some description, and from her shoulders, the heat notwithstanding, hung an utterly yellowed and moth-eaten fur jacket. Every moment or so the old woman coughed and groaned. The old man must have glanced at her in some special way, for her eyes suddenly flickered again with their erstwhile suspicion. "My name's Raskolnikov. I'm a student. I came to see you about a month ago," the man uttered hastily, bowing slightly, because he had recalled that he must be as courteous as possible. "I remember, dearie. I remember your visit very well," the old woman said distinctly, without removing her earlier questioning gaze from his features. "So you see I'm here again, about the same thing," Raskolnikov went on, feeling slightly put out, taken off his guard by the old woman's suspicious attitude. "I suppose she must always be like this, and I simply didn't notice last time," he thought, with an unpleasant sensation. The old woman was silent for a moment, as though she were deliberating. Then she moved to one side and said, pointing to the door of her room, as she admitted her visitor ahead of her, "In you go, dearie." The little room, into which the young man passed with its yellow wallpaper, its geraniums and muslin curtains, was at that moment brightly illuminated by the setting sun. So the sun would be shining like this then, too, was the thought that flickered almost unexpectedly through Raskolnikov's mind. And with a swift glance he took everything in the room, in order as far as possible to study and remember its position. But the room contained nothing very much in particular. The furniture, all of it very old, made of yellow wood, consisted of a sofa with an enormous curved back, an oval table that stood in front of it, a mirrored dressing table standing in between the two windows, chairs along the walls, and one or two cheap prints in yellow frames depicting German girls with birds in their hands, and that was all. In one corner a lamp burned in front of a small icon. Everything was clean. Both furniture and floors had been rubbed until they shone. "That's Lisavetta's work," the young man thought to himself. There was not a speck of dust to be found in the whole apartment. "It's the sort of cleanliness you generally find in the homes of sour old widows," Raskolnikov reflected, continuing his train of thought as he cast a dubious and inquisitive look at the chintz curtain that masked the door into a second tiny room. This accommodated the old woman's bed and chest of drawers, and he had never yet glimpsed its interior. The entire apartment consisted of these two rooms. "What's your business?" snapped the little old woman, coming into the room and positioning herself in front of him as before, in order to be able to look at him straight in the face. "I've got something I want to pawn. Here, look." And from his pocket he produced an old flat silver watch. Its back bore an engraving of a globe. The chain was of steel. "But you haven't redeemed the thing you pawned last time yet. Your time limit ran out 2 days ago. I'll pay you another month's interest. Be patient." "Dearie, it's up to me whether I'm patient or whether I sell you what you pawned this very day." "How much will you give me for the watch, Alyona Ivanovna?" I probably butchered that name. "Well, dearie, you come to me with such rubbish it's practically worthless. I let you have 2 tickets for that ring last time, and you could have bought one new at a jeweler's for ₹1.50. Let me have 4. I promise I'll redeem it. It belonged to my father. I'm expecting some money soon." ₹1.50, and the interest in advance. That's the best I can do." ₹1.50, the young man exclaimed. "It's up to you," and the old woman handed his watch back to him. The young man took it so angry that he nearly stormed out of the apartment. He had once had second thoughts, however, remembering that there was nowhere else he could try, and that in any case he had another purpose for his visit. "All right, go on then," he said roughly. The old woman reached into her pocket for her keys and went behind the curtain into the other room. Left alone in the middle of the other room, the young man listened curiously, trying to work out what she was doing. He could hear her unlocking the chest of drawers. It must be the top drawer, he thought. So she keeps her keys in her right-hand pocket, all in one bunch, on a steel ring, and there's one key that's bigger than all the others, 3 times the size, with a notched bit. It can't be the one to the chest drawers, obviously. There must be some kind of box or chest in there, too. That's interesting. Chests often have keys like that. God, how dishonorable all this is. The old woman returned. "Now then, dearie, the interest 10% a month, so on ₹1.50 you owe me 15 kopecks, payable in advance. You owe me 20 kopecks on the 2 rubles you had before. That comes to 35 kopecks. So what you get for your watch is ₹1.15. Here you are." "What? It's down to ₹1.15 now, is it?" "That's right, dearie." The young man did not attempt to argue. you and took the money. He looked at the old woman and made no sign of being in a hurry to leave, as though there were something else he wanted to say or do, but did not quite himself know what it was. I may bring you something else in a day or two. I cannot say that name. Alyona Ivanovna. An item of silver, good quality, a cigarette case. As soon as I get it back from a friend of mine. He grew confused and fell silent. Right you are then, dearie. We'll talk about it when you come back. Goodbye then. I say, do you spend all the time alone here? Isn't your sister around? He asked as casually as he could, going out onto the hallway. And what would you be wanting with her, dearie? Oh, nothing in particular. I was simply asking. I mean, just now, you... Goodbye, Alyona. Raskolnikov went out, feeling decidedly confused. The confusion got worse and worse. As he descended the stairs, he even stopped several times, as though he had been struck by some sudden thought, and at last, when he was out on the street, he exclaimed, "Oh God, how loathsome all this is! And could I really? No, it's nonsensical, it's absurd," he added firmly. "Could I really have ever contemplated such a monstrous act? It shows what filth my heart is capable of, though. Yes, that's what it is. Filthy, mean, vile. And for a whole month I've been..." But he could find neither words nor exclamations with which to give voice to his disturbed state of mind. The sense of infinite loathing that had begun to crush and sicken his heart even while he had only been on his way to the old woman had now attained such dimensions and become so vividly conscious that he was quite simply overwhelmed by his depression. He moved along the pavement like a drunkard, not noticing the passers-by and knocking into them, and only recovered himself when he reached the next street. Looking around, he observed that he was standing beside a drinking den, the entrance to which lay down from the pavement, at the foot of some steps in the basement. Just at that moment, two drunks emerged from the doorway and began to clamber their way up to the street level, supporting each other and cursing. Without so much as a thought, Raskolnikov went down the steps. Never before had he been a visitor to the drinking dens, but now his head was spinning, and what was more, he was parched by a burning thirst. He wanted some cold beer, all the more so since he attributed his sudden state of debility to the fact that he had nothing in his stomach. In a dark and dirty corner he found himself a seat and a sticky little table, asked for some beer, and drank his first glass of it with avid greed. The relief he experienced was total and immediate, and his thoughts brightened up. "This is all a lot of nonsense," he said to himself with hope. "There was no need for me to get into such a flap. It was just physical exhaustion. One glass of beer, a sukar, and in a single moment the mind gained strength. One's thoughts grew lucid and one's intentions firm. Pah! What trivial rubbish all this is." But this contemptuous spit notwithstanding, he already looked cheerful, as if he had suddenly freed himself from some terrible burden, and his eyes cast round at other people there in a friendly manner. But even as he did so, he had a distant sense that all his optimism was also morbid. At the time there were only a few people left in the drinking den. The two drunk men he had encountered on the steps had been followed out almost immediately by a whole crowd of about 5, with one tart and a concertina. After their departure the place seemed quiet and empty. There remained one fellow, a tradesman by the look of him, who was intoxicated, but only slightly, sitting with his beer, and his companion, an enormous, fat, grey-bearded man in a Siberian kaftan, thoroughly intoxicated, who had fallen asleep on a bench, and who ever so often, suddenly, as though in his sleep, snapping his fingers and throwing his arms apart, would begin to make the upper part of his body jerk up and down, and without getting up from the bench, croon some nonsense or other, making an effort to remember the words, which sounded something like, "1 whole year his wife he stroked. 1 whole year his wife he stroked," or having woken up again, down the civil servant's road, there he found his girl of old. But no one sharpened his happiness. Indeed, his silent companion viewed all these sudden explosions with hostility and suspicion. There was another man in the den who, by his outward appearance, could have been taken for a retired civil servant. He was sitting apart from his other man in front of his jug of vodka. And from time to time taking a sip from his glass and looking around him. He also appeared to be in some state of agitation. And that is chapter 1. I expect I will read the rest of this on my own time.